People often assume these towns look ruined in obvious ways: collapsed buildings, visible chaos, dramatic scenes. The truth is more unsettling. Most of them still function just enough to appear normal at first glance. Streetlights turn on, mail arrives, schools open. Barely. That thin layer of normalcy masks how fragile everything underneath has become. When systems operate at the edge of failure for years, survival replaces progress. Maintaining what little remains becomes the main goal, not improving it. Take employment. In many of these towns, jobs did not vanish completely. They narrowed. One factory becomes the factory. One prison becomes the economic anchor. A handful of dollar stores replace a diverse local economy. Work exists, but it is limited, low mobility, and vulnerable. Lose that single employer and the entire town wobbles. Opportunity becomes something you leave town to find, not something you build locally. Young people notice this early. Those who can leave do. Those who stay inherit stagnation. Healthcare tells a similar story. Clinics consolidate, hospitals close or reduce services, specialists disappear. Preventive care becomes a luxury when driving an hour is required for an appointment. In emergencies, distance matters. Outcomes worsen quietly, not in headlines but in statistics that rise slowly year after year. Life expectancy dips, chronic conditions spread, mental health strain grows. None of this is dramatic enough to trend online, but it compounds relentlessly. Infrastructure decay rarely starts with collapse, it starts with delays. Road repairs postponed, water systems patched instead of replaced, power lines fixed temporarily. Budgets stretch thinner each year until permanent solutions become impossible. Municipal leaders operate in crisis mode indefinitely. Grants are applied for, committees are formed, plans are written. Funding rarely arrives at the scale required. When it does, it targets symptoms, not root causes. A new park does not replace a missing employer. Cosmetic improvements do not rebuild tax bases. Education suffers quietly. Schools lose students as populations shrink. Funding tied to enrollment declines. Programs are cut, class sizes combine. Advanced courses disappear. Teachers leave for districts with better pay and stability. Students grow up with fewer options and lower exposure to opportunity. This is not because of lack of effort or intelligence, it is structural narrowing. The latter exists, but several rungs have been removed. What makes these conditions resemble the developing world is not absolute poverty, but unevenness. A wealthy country with pockets where basic services fail creates stark contrasts. Clean water in one county, contamination in the next. Broadband on one side of a river, dead zones across it. This inconsistency is disorienting. Residents live within a nation of abundance, yet experience scarcity daily. That contradiction breeds frustration, resignation, and eventually normalization. Social fabric changes under this pressure. Churches and community centers become support systems. Informal networks replace formal ones. People rely on neighbors because institutions have thinned out. Pride remains, but it is mixed with fatigue. Outsiders misunderstand this resilience as acceptance. It is not. It is adaptation. There is a difference. Adapting keeps you alive. Thriving requires options. The real cost of living in these towns is psychological. You wake up knowing your choices are limited. You budget around distance, scarcity, and unpredictability. Plans are conservative because risk is expensive. A car breakdown becomes a major crisis. Medical issues threaten financial collapse. Saving becomes difficult when income barely covers needs. Cheap housing no longer feels like an advantage. It feels like an anchor. Critics often ask why people do not just leave. That question ignores reality. Leaving requires money, information, and a destination. It assumes opportunity is evenly distributed. It assumes mobility is free. Moving is risk, and risk is harder when safety nets are thin. For many residents, staying is not preference, it is constraint. They remain not because the town is good, but because leaving is worse. This is the stage where decline becomes self-reinforcing. Low investment produces poor outcomes. Poor outcomes deter investment. Political influence shrinks with population. Visibility fades. Eventually, these towns exist primarily as cautionary examples. Cheap houses become content hooks. Their suffering becomes entertainment for people who will never go there. And yet, these places persist. People still live, love, work, and raise families inside them. That reality complicates the narrative. They are not ruins, they are communities under strain. Understanding that distinction matters because it reveals how fragile prosperity actually is. The gap between thriving and falling behind is narrower than most people think. These towns did not collapse suddenly. They slid, slowly, quietly, until the slide felt permanent. It's easy to think America is finished being built, that every road is paved, every system works, and every town waits for opportunity to arrive. That's the postcard story, the version sold in headlines and election speeches. But beyond the exits nobody photographs, there are places where basic services flicker, where jobs disappeared decades ago, and where survival replaced ambition. These towns are not accidents or temporary failures, they are results. They exist because decisions were made, budgets shifted, and attention moved elsewhere. Today, we are entering that ignored map space, the America most people drive past without stopping. The first thing people notice is the price. A house listed for $23,000 sounds like a loophole in the system, a secret the rich forgot to close. Click the listing and you imagine freedom. No mortgage, no rent stress, maybe a yard, maybe quiet. But price is never the full story. In these towns, the low cost is not a discount, it is a warning label. Cheap property often signals missing jobs, failing infrastructure, unreliable utilities, and communities cut off from opportunity. You are not buying a bargain, you are inheriting the consequences of neglect. What makes these places shocking is not that they are poor. Poverty exists everywhere. What makes them unsettling is how long the decline has lasted and how normal it has become. Schools closed one by one, factories shut down and never reopened. Young people left and did not return. Emergency rooms moved farther away. Small problems piled up until they hardened into permanent conditions. At some point, decline stops being news and becomes background noise. That is when places truly disappear, not physically, but politically and economically. There is a pattern repeated across these towns. Industry arrives, usually drawn by cheap labor or natural resources. Work follows, families build lives. Then conditions change. Automation, globalization, mergers. Profits move upward and outward. Jobs leave. Tax bases collapse. Infrastructure decays. Assistance arrives late or not at all. Locals are told to adapt, but adaptation requires capital, education, and mobility. Those who have it leave. Those who do not remain. Staying slowly becomes proof of endurance, not choice. When outsiders visit, they often describe these towns as quiet, but quiet is misleading. This is not peace, it is absence. Empty storefronts do not hum with potential, they echo with what used to be there. Streets without traffic are not charming when businesses are gone. Silence becomes heavy when it is broken only by distant sirens or barking dogs. Even the landscape feels paused, as if the town is waiting for a future that keeps being postponed. Housing prices fall because demand disappears. Banks avoid issuing mortgages, insurance rates climb, contractors move away. Repairs cost more because no one services the area anymore. That cheap house starts requiring long drives for groceries, doctors, and work. Every mile adds cost. Every delay adds risk. The freedom promised by low prices slowly converts into dependence on unreliable systems. When power goes out or water fails, there is no backup plan. There is just waiting. These towns are often labeled as failures, but failure implies a fair attempt with poor results. What happened here is different. These places were used, then sidelined. Investment did not dry up naturally, it was redirected. Growth clustered elsewhere, while decline was managed, not reversed. National conversations rarely include these locations because their populations shrink and their influence fades. Policy follows attention, and attention follows money. By the time a house reaches $23,000, the damage is already baked in. Schools struggle to retain teachers, clinics close, public transport evaporates, broadband arrives late or never. It becomes harder to imagine a future that looks different from the present. Hope turns abstract. This is how living conditions slide, not overnight, but gradually, until comparison to a developing nation stops sounding exaggerated. And this is only the beginning, because the deeper you go into these places, the more you realize that cheap housing is only the surface symptom. What lies underneath is something far more expensive. By the time a town reaches this point, recovery is no longer about one good year or one new project. It would require sustained attention, consistent funding, and political will over decades. That reality is uncomfortable, so it is often avoided. It is easier to label these places as bad investments than to admit they reflect national priorities. The housing prices tell you what the market thinks a future is worth there. $23,000 is not a bargain, it is a valuation of expectations. What separates these towns from temporary downturns is that time itself works against them. Each year of neglect compounds. Roofs rot faster than savings grow, roads degrade quicker than budgets recover. Children grow up without exposure to opportunities that exist a few counties over. By adulthood, the distance between where they are and where growth happens feels impossible to cross. Inequality hardens into geography. At that stage, relocation is not a choice. It is an escape plan few can afford. There's also a psychological trap embedded in cheap living. When your cost of entry is low, it feels irresponsible to leave. You tell yourself you can manage, that things might improve, that at least expenses are low. Over time, that logic keeps people in environments that drain momentum. Years pass, options narrow. Eventually, the town shapes expectations downward. Dreams resize themselves to fit the surroundings. That is the quiet damage no property listing discloses. These towns are often portrayed as warnings, but rarely as systems failures. The narrative focuses on crime, poverty, or individual decisions, not structural absence. Yet the pattern repeats across states, cultures, and industries. Whenever growth is extracted without reinvestment, this outcome follows. Whether it's mining regions, factory towns, or agricultural hubs, the ending looks similar. What changes is only the scenery. Comparisons to the developing world trigger defensiveness because they challenge identity. People assume such conditions cannot exist domestically. But development is not a permanent status, it is maintained. When maintenance stops, regression begins. Roads, water, education, healthcare are not achievements you unlock once. They are processes you fund continuously. These towns show what happens when maintenance is treated as optional. For viewers tempted by the fantasy of cheap property, this is where perspective matters. A $23,000 house does not free you from systems. It ties you more tightly to the weakest ones. You become dependent on unstable infrastructure, limited services, and distant opportunity. Every savings calculation must include risk premiums people rarely account for. Distance, health, employment volatility, and time all charge interest. That doesn't mean these towns lack value or dignity. It means price alone cannot measure livability. People here are not failures. They are participants in an uneven economy that rewards mobility and punishes rootedness. Many stayed to care for family. Others lacked pathways out. Their presence does not validate the conditions. It highlights them. The question is not whether these places deserve saving. It is why saving them is always framed as optional. When growth concentrates narrowly, decline spreads quietly. Society absorbs the contrast until it becomes normal. At that point, the idea that some Americans live without reliable water or health care stops feeling urgent. It becomes background knowledge, occasionally rediscovered through viral videos, then forgotten again. Understanding these towns is not about avoiding them at all costs. It's about recognizing warning signs everywhere else. Population loss, employer concentration, deferred infrastructure, shrinking schools, these are early signals. Ignoring them does not keep decline contained, it allows it to expand. Today, it's a $23,000 house in a forgotten town. Tomorrow, it's a neighborhood, then a city, then a region. These towns should not shock us, they should clarify how fragile prosperity really is. Growth is loud, decline is quiet. By the time the price drops low enough to grab attention, the underlying systems have already eroded. What you're seeing is the end of a long process, not the beginning. So, when you see those listings, pause. Ask what had to disappear for the price to fall that far. Ask what distances you would have to accept. Ask what support systems are missing. Cheap housing is never just about housing. It's about the story of a place and how much of that story has already been written without you. These towns are not relics of the past. They are previews, and whether they remain isolated examples or become more common depends on what is prioritized next.